Welcome to Observations on Urban Nature. After introductions, our program will begin with a presentation by Peter del Tredici, which will be followed by a dialogue between Peter and Rosetta Elkin. As time allows, we'll take questions from participants via the Q&A tab following their dialogue. I'm Pam Thompson, Manager of Adult Education with the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University. The Arnold Arboretum is a 281-acre Olmsted-designed landscape and highly curated world-class research collection of temperate trees, shrubs, and vines. The Arboretum is also a public park within the city of Boston, offering a space for learning, wellness, and respite to all. We've collaborated this evening with Bartlett Arboretum and Gardens. Michael Beletsky, their Director of Education, will now say a few words.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are very happy to be co-sponsoring this event with the Arnold Arboretum. And I'd just like to introduce the Bartlett and let you know a little bit about what we are. Bartlett Arboretum and Gardens is a 93-acre nature sanctuary in Southwest Connecticut. We maintain a diverse collection of trees, gardens, and plants and celebrate the biodiversity and reflect the ecology and character of our region. We provide comprehensive environmental, horticultural, and plant science programs for children and adults, and we encourage sustainable principles and environmental stewardship. The Arboretum was founded by Francis Bartlett, and Francis Bartlett was also the founder of Bartlett Tree Experts, which is one of the most prominent tree companies in the world. So you may have heard of them. So thank you very much, and I'd like to turn it back over to Pam so she can introduce our panelists.
All right, thank you, Michael, and welcome to all who are signed on. Rosetta Elkin is Associate Professor of the Peter Guo Fu School of Architecture at McGill University in Montreal. She is joining us, though, from Massachusetts. She is a landscape architect, principal of RSE Landscape, and an associate at the Arnold Arboretum. Rosetta's research and teaching consider living environments with a particular focus on plants in ecology, horticulture, and human affairs, more broadly. She is committed to design as a means to address the risk, injustice, and instability brought about by the shifts in our shared climate. Elkin's work suggests that the role of plants is generally overlooked in the study of climate change. As a result, projects are positioned to heighten the awareness of plant life. Elkin's practice prioritizes public exhibitions, open access publishing, and collaborative research to promote a more thoughtful and accountable design agenda. Thank you, Rosetta, for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Pam. I have the pleasure of both speaking to Peter and also introducing him. And you can all read his bio, generously listed on his unique and recently redesigned website, peterdeltredici.com. So as a note of introduction, I'll take a minute instead to reflect upon Peter's work rather than his notably impressive CV. I'd like to point out that Peter's work is based on a kind of observation that goes beyond viewing and identifying. It reaches into what I'd like to call a practice of noticing. Peter works between his critical intellect on the one hand and the experience of visible, sensuous beauty of nature on the other, because what Peter knows and wants to share with us, with others, is essentially a love of the planted world and the plant life around us. So for myself, that's not only a realization, which deeply felt from my friendship with Peter, but also a motivation to value in our outlandish times how individual experiences speak to our collective nature, our collective ambitions. And in realizing this, I'd also like to acknowledge that when Peter first published this wonderful book, Wild Urban Plants of the Northeast, which obviously we all have earmarked and post-it noted and whatnot on our desks. But yes, so he published it first in 2010, and he was sharing with us his own sort of laborious discoveries. And no wonder that these discoveries surprised us. More to the point, 10 years later, 10 years of hotter hots and colder colds and the urgency of climate change, overly mingled with politics, and a decade of unrestrained urbanization, concretization, expansion, sprawl, development, that not only underlies the ecological disruption we live with, but sets the stage for the spontaneous plants that surround us, and thus invite us into a world more attuned to change. So Peter, in this book, really asks us to join in his quest to identify and associate with plants that are truly hard to love. So it is my great pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Peter del Tredici, and I invite him to share his screen and share his insights on the arts of noticing plants that endure through our best laid plans. Peter?
All right. Well, thank you, Rosetta, for that introduction. That's going to be a hard act to follow. And Pam, I want to thank you too. Truth be told, this was supposed to be an in-person talk at the Arboretum in April. It was part of my book launch. And so it was the first of many such lectures that were canceled. So, you know, c'est la vie, I guess, is what, you know, I've adapted. We've all had to adapt to these incredible times we're living in. And so, you know, rather than just give a lecture like I would have given if it's been at the Arboretum, an hour-long lecture, and then take questions, I thought that, you know, people's attention span on Zoom are just not like that. Watching a lecture for an hour is really difficult. So I thought what I would do is just to present a very short version of the book, 20 minutes. It really talks about my philosophy. What is the philosophy behind writing this book? And then Rosetta and I will engage in a bit of a conversation, asking questions and answering them, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So that's the general format, and I'll just jump right in. Now, this first slide, people always ask me if I photoshopped it. The answer is no. I took this picture in Detroit, and it's really, you know, what this picture is about is those trees that surround this garbage dump. And those are the ailanthus trees. That's the Ailanthus altissima, the tree that grows in Brooklyn, and in that famous novel. And it really is, you know, it says a lot about, you know, sort of the, what's, you know, life like in the urban environment. And this is the book, of course. This is the second edition. It came out in March of this year. It's expanded by 20%. And it's actually, you know, as Rosetta mentioned, I sort of changed the focus from the first edition, which was really about urban ecology. This book is really much more about climate change and, you know, how climate change is playing out through the lens of urban vegetation. And, you know, if you look at the breakdown of the book, about a third of the species are native to North America and Central America. For about 44% from Europe and Central Asia, 13% to East Asia, that'd be Korea, Japan, Eastern China, 8% are native across the circumpolar in Eurasia and North America, and about 1% to Africa. So, you know, the take-home message here is the vegetation of our cities is really a reflection of, you know, it's as cosmopolitan as the human population. And this is the basic structure of the book for those of you who haven't seen it. It's, you know, a series of 2-page spreads. On the left is the text, and it is, you know, it's in a template form. I ask a certain set of questions about each species, you know, its name, vegetative characteristics, flowers and fruit characteristics, germination, regeneration, habitat preferences, ecological functions, and then cultural significance. And every page, those same categories are carried through. And then on the right-hand side is either 5 or 6 photographs that show images of the plant at all seasons of the year. So it's really just 2-page spreads. You can just sort of leaf through it, what we say, go fishing in it, and, you know, try to find a match for the plant you're looking for. And I do want to point out one thing, though, is that that section on cultural significance. I wrote this book for my students at the GSD Many of them did not have science backgrounds, and I found that the thing that most interested them is the connection of this plant to human society. So I made a big deal out of that and said, we're going to really feature that. And it turns out that most people who have the book, that is their favorite section of the book. So I'm very proud of how did this plant, what is it that how this plant ended up in the city. And the other thing I want to say is that I take a visual approach to learning how to identify plants. And, there's over 1,200 photographs in the book, of which I took 1,150 of them. And, I've been photographing these plants for, upwards of 20 years, basically. And this makes it possible just to sort of leaf through it. And even, young children can pick up this book and by leafing through it to say, oh, I've seen that plant. I recognize that plant. And the key is it's not just based on flower characteristics, the way most field guides are. It really focuses not only on the vegetative, what the plant actually looks like, but then also what the plant's habitat is. So I went out of my way to try and capture the habitat where the plant is growing. And, I'm just going to show you a few images that, sort of represent my vision. This is, and a lot of these were taken in the Boston area. This is along the Charles River in Watertown, this sensational specimen of poison ivy on DCR land. They'd be super embarrassed if they know. They've since removed this, but this is the way the plant looks. You wouldn't even recognize it. It's so outrageous. And then not too far, this is the concrete bridge. This is our crumbling infrastructure that everybody's always talking about. And, again, this is under the influence of acid precipitation. The concrete dissolves and it creates these sort of pockets of limestone soil, and a plant like chicory here flourishes. So again, this is not only does it tell you what the plant is, but where you're going to find it and what does it require? What are its habitat requirements? And of course, one of my least favorite plants in the Northeast is the Oriental Bittersweet. And this is, again, that's a railroad bridge. It's right next to the Mass Pike. The beauty of this book is that these are the plants that are all around us. And, typically nobody pays any attention to. So the purpose of the book is really to get people to think about the environment that they live in, basically. So, there's no trips to the Galapagos in my book. This is really just looking at what exists in your, backyard, if you will. And I have taken to calling my book a field guide to being stuck at home, with COVID. This is, you can't go anywhere, so you might as well learn the plants that are growing right outside your front door. This is, we all know about flowering crab apples, but very few people realize that they're actually an important component of the spontaneous urban flora. On the left, that's a picture of a flowering crab apple seedling on the High Line before it was developed into what it's become today. So that picture was taken a long time ago. And there's an incredible spontaneous specimen in growing in Detroit. So here's something that we're used to as a cultivated plant, but then it takes on sort of a whole different meaning when it becomes part of the spontaneous flora of the city. And I must say that in urban woodlands, the flowering crab apples are one of the most common understory trees that we have. And of course, we're all familiar with, Virginia creeper as a woodland plant climbing up tree trunks and, telephone poles in the countryside. But in the city, every once in a while, it's allowed to do its thing, and it's just sensational. So this, the chain link fence is an incredible, a very specific urban habitat, and the plants have made that adjustment. So, my definition of urbanization, this is by, density of human population. This is the range of my book. It goes from, Boston to essentially Washington, D.C. to Detroit to Montreal. And that's that's the Northeast as I define it. And, the closer you are sort of to, the density is sort of right in the middle of New York City, but going north and west, most of the plants that grow in those cities are also treated in this book. And urbanization, we're not talking about, sidewalk cracks or, it's a major geological force. And, this is if you don't recognize it, this is downtown Los Angeles. And you see on the right-hand side there, that's the Los Angeles River in its trough. And, there's a lot of talk, and there has been for a very long time, about, native versus non-native species. And we have to restore the native vegetation, and non-native plants are not good. And, they don't feed the insects the way natives do, and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at this picture, you realize that, the concept of a native plant in an urban environment like Los Angeles, it's an absurd notion. All the native vegetation has been totally wiped out by urbanization. And you might have some native plants down there, but you have a totally unique environment there. And the plants that are growing there are adapted to that environment. And what was there, before the European settlers arrived, that's interesting, and that's a historical artifact, but it's not necessarily relevant to the conditions that exist today. And I like to equate urbanization with glaciation. And, I think of the heavy equipment as the urban glacier, and, it just wipes everything out. That's the urban process. And then what it leaves in its wake is compacted glacial till. You bring in the landscape contractors, they put 2 inches of topsoil down there and sow some grass, and you've got primary succession. And if you bring this home to Boston, the red there, that's the original topography of the Shawmut Peninsula, as it was known. And then the beige was filled in prior to 1880, and the dark blue after 1880. And so, 17% of the land area of Boston is built on fill. And the question becomes, what is the native vegetation of filled soil? Of course, there's no native vegetation, it's new land. And so, this whole idea of somehow going back to some state of nativity, particularly in an urban context, it doesn't really tell you much about what's actually happening in a real world sense. But the key is that the plants know what's going on, and the plants are responding to the conditions that they find. So this is mugwort, a European species that likes high pH soils. It comes from limestone meadows in Europe, and we heavily put road salt everywhere. Nobody wants to compromise public safety for a few plants. And that road salt has the chemical effect of elevating the pHs, the soil pH of our roadways. And this is a plant that is sensitive to soil pH and essentially gets established in response to all of the road salts that's applied. So this is actually what's happening. There's a reason why these plants are growing where they are growing. And, the book really tries to explain why it is that this plant is here and not over here. And, there are all these little details in the urban environment that we don't, pay much attention to, but chain link fences represent what ecologists would call safe sites, where the vegetation, the maintenance people can't get to it. And this becomes the equivalent of, the rural hedgerows that you see in England, or, the stone walls that grow up with vegetation in, agricultural New England. And this is where the wildlife hangs out. So this is the way, the urban environment is structured, and chain link fences play a really important role in promoting the spread of vegetation. Now, it may not be vegetation we like or we want, but, this is ecology, and ecology is not necessarily about what we like and what we want. And, I just love this quotation from the first guidebook that was ever written for Central Park. "Blessed dandelions in such beautiful profusion as we have never seen elsewhere, making the lawns in places like green lakes, reflecting a heaven sown with stars." I mean, that's such poetic. This is before people hated dandelions. And the fact of the matter is you couldn't do anything about them anyway, so you just learned to love them. And, what's really ironic is that, there's now, $1 billion industry, the Scott's Chemical Corporation, devoted to killing dandelions. The lawns that we create are the perfect habitat for dandelions, and the mowing that we do promotes their growth and their spread. So, you know, there's this weird symbiosis between the chemical industry and the dandelion. They sort of need each other. And, you know, now, of course, everybody is talking about using them for medicinal purposes. But, you know, the fact of the matter is this plant under, you know, the influence of humans has just exploded. It was, you know, a very minor player in European ecology. And then with the invention of the lawn and the mowing regime, the dandelion has just taken off. So this is, again, this is what urban ecology is all about. And, you know, one of the things about plants that is, you know, the plants that grow in a city, they're not adapted to the city, but they're what's called pre-adapted. They come from habitats in nature that resemble those found in the urban environment. So here's the ailanthus tree on the, you know, the dry limestone hills around Beijing, on the Great Wall, to be exact. And there it is on the Great Wall opposite the Arnold Arboretum. So the ailanthus tree in this case has found its exact match for its habitat. And European ecologists have determined, if you look at, it doesn't explain the distribution of all urban plants, but about 60 to 65% of them are plants that grow well in soils that are relatively fertile, dry, sunny, and alkaline. So this is your profile of your typical urban plant. This is the environment. These are the conditions that dominate the urban environment, and plants that can tolerate those conditions are the ones that flourish. And so this is urban ecology. This is what's really happening. And this is a, you know, just to summarize, basically, you know, when you think about the urban ecosystem, interacting, urbanization, globalization, and climate warming destabilize native ecosystems and favor the spread of opportunistic species. And it can be native or non-native. I showed you the picture of poison ivy, and you know about ragweed, and you know, it's not all about native and non-native. Water, air, and ground pollution impact soil chemistry, which impacts microbial activity, which impacts nutrient cycling, which impacts vegetation. So, you know, everything we do bad to the environment, it ends up either in the soil or it ends up in the ocean. And, you know, that's really, if you want to study plants, you need to understand the soil. And the plants are just like the icing on the cake, but the soil itself is the actual cake. And so, you know, urban soil is, you know, very different from rural soil, and it's quite different from agricultural soil as well. Habitat fragmentation creates sunny edges dominated by fast-growing disturbance-adapted species. So that's, again, a hallmark of the urban environment. So, you know, the good news from my perspective is that plants that grow spontaneously, now I'm not talking about the ones that you plant in our cities and along the roadways, they have already adapted to our changing environmental conditions. Okay, so that is, the plants know, there's no denying climate change if you're a plant, okay? It's happening, and it's either you adapt or you're gone. So I like to call my book in fact, I wanted to change the subtitle, but the publisher wouldn't let me do it, The Flora of the Future, because these plants are the ones that are best adapted to what's happening in our world today, and they're becoming more common, okay? The idea that somehow or other there's going to be less of them, that is not what is happening. And the other thing that's really important is, you know, when you talk about urban plants, is context has a lot to do with, you know, how we view these plants. So here's the Japanese knotweed, the plant that everybody hates, growing, you know, in Brighton, Massachusetts, and it's not doing anything. I mean, look at the habitat where it's growing. It's just there. But here's the same species growing along the White River in Vermont that, you know, exploded following this hurricane that passed through Vermont, Irene, in 2011. And here, the knotweed is a terrible problem, and because you know, it's displaced most of the native vegetation, and both banks of the river are covered by it. So I'm not saying that these plants are, you know, intrinsically, you know, good or bad. They're just, it really depends on the context in which they're growing, and that's one of the real problems, I think, with this, you know, dividing everything up into, either good or bad, native or non-native. It doesn't really, it kind of doesn't really explain things. So the context in which a plant is growing is really, that's where the value judgments come in, because we're constantly making value judgments about plants. Another example would be this Phragmites. Some of you might recognize this, the New Jersey meadowlands, the Hackensack Meadows, opposite Manhattan. You're driving on the New Jersey Turnpike, and you could look at this expanse of Phragmites and say, oh my God, the invasive genotype from Europe has taken over this area. We've got to get rid of it. Or you could say, well, there's a history of over 500 landfills being put in this area, and the Phragmites is actually helping to clean up this area. And, I want to restore the salt meadow cordgrass. This is what was there before the Phragmites. And I like to say, well, if you did want to restore the salt meadow cordgrass, that would be very, I won't say easy, but I will say straightforward thing to do. All you have to do is remove the New Jersey Turnpike and you reestablish the tidal flow into the meadowlands. You get some salt water in there and the Phragmites will disappear. But in the meantime, with the turnpike there, Phragmites likes that brackish water. And this is the conditions that created, that explains why the Phragmites is so dominant. So, these plants in many cases are symptomatic of degradation. They are not the cause of the degradation. So that's a really important point. And, you're sort of come with me this far, so we'll just go all the way. And, it's a premise of my book that, in fact, these plants in urban contexts are actually helping to make the city more livable, not only for its human inhabitants, but also for all the wildlife that relies on vegetation for food and shelter. And this is just a list that I put together of the various services that, these plants provide, and they're doing it at no cost to the taxpayer. So, again, tell me what the problem is, because yes, if you want to build a park and with the, maintenance, go right ahead and do it. But, in the meantime, if you don't have the resources to do that, that vegetation that's there is actually serving some very important purposes. And, this is where, hopefully we'll talk a little bit about this because these what are called novel ecosystems, what we should be thinking about is how do we manage them in such a way as to enhance their ecological and their aesthetic value. And it's not just about getting rid of them because they're not native. And, this is a beautiful black locust stand over at the Audubon Center in Mattapan, actually. And it's an example of what I refer to as design by removal, or intaglio. And this is how you manage it. So you decide that there's certain plants I like, certain ones that, I don't like or problematic, and you essentially, it's an editing process. Let's talk about it like that, as opposed to a writing process where you have to create from nothing. And I make this point, it's really important that when you work with these novel ecosystems, this is Bussy Brook and the Arnold Arboretum, it's more about managing the ecosystem, sort of trying to move it in certain directions. It's not about maintenance. Maintenance is about maintaining the status quo. You have a design and you prune the trees and shrubs and you mow the lawn to keep it looking a certain way. That's not how that's not what you do with these novel ecosystems. So if you were going to do this, do you want to take out high climbing vines that will strangle trees, diseased or damaged trees that are hazards to people, plants that are unfriendly or unhealthy? That'd be, barberry, ragweed, poison ivy, unsightly or aggressive plants that are perceived as indicators of dereliction of neglect and neglect. So, I like Ailanthus personally, but if you talk to somebody who lives in one of these low-income neighborhoods, they hate Ailanthus because it's an indicator of abandonment as far as they're concerned, and they don't want it in their neighborhood. And you have to sort of respect that. That's a very legitimate idea. So, this is what I said earlier, but, when you start working with these novel ecosystems that are a really important part of the urban environment, it's really, a management process. And then this is my very last slide, so we can just sort of jump right into our discussion that, well, you can read that for yourselves. And I'm sure they're going to put that on my tombstone, actually, because, the world is changing. It's changing incredibly rapidly. And, we have to, keep up. And if we don't keep up, we all know what's going to happen. And that's an important lesson that we can learn from the plants that are growing in our city. So thank you very much for your attention. And I will close this out, and Rosetta, you can take it away.
All right. Wow. Thank you, Peter, for another remarkable journey. It's always a journey to walk around the city with Peter. It's again a journey to be on Zoom at home on the same kind of journey. So thank you for taking us through the streets and the back alleys. You raised so many points that while I tried to be prepared, I knew that I would have to sort of think on my feet. This accidental wilderness that we have, and yeah, I just keep thinking that another byline for your book could be the how you articulate the critical urge to find interest not in the natural world per se, but in how the natural world makes out in spite of change. And I guess that in your quest, this arts of noticing I was mentioning, you probably find a few plants that really stop you in your tracks, perhaps figuratively and literally. And I was thinking, we could just go right to page 58 or to slide 15 and think about bittersweet for a moment longer.
Bittersweet.
And in the book you describe it's a woody vine or liana, but you describe it as having a trunk and stems, of course, because that's where it gets to. And I find that incredibly interesting in relation to your last point about the difference between maintenance and management, right? Of course, stems produce shoots following damage. So like a lot of the plants you describe, the effort to sort of maintain them is overwhelmingly successful, let's say, from the point of view of plant fitness, right? So this is such a resourceful adaptation to disturbance and the transient habitats that our warming climate creates. So could you take a moment to talk about the overlooked distinction? I know you mentioned it, but I think it really frames a lot of what we do as designers, and hopefully what we all do as gardeners, stewards, and the like. The distinction that's so often overlooked. For instance, can we really talk about maintenance in relation to bittersweet? Or obviously, maybe not obviously, is it more fitting to discuss management?
Well, I mean, you raised so many points, I don't even know where to begin. But the thing about, these vines, these lianas, a woody vine, is that they're essentially, they invest most of their energy that they produce into producing leaves, and their trunk is very small relative to their foliage. And basically, because they do that, they just grow. And so when you expose most vines to high levels of CO2, they just produce more leaves, whereas trees have very different, they invest a huge amount of energy into producing a trunk, and that's going to support them for 100 years. And so when you expose a lot of tree species, with the exception maybe of poplars and things like that, they don't know what to do with that extra CO2. So they aren't able to take advantage of it. Whereas vines are the one life form around the world that is exploding as the CO2 levels rise, because you expose vines to CO2, they just produce more leaves. And they are what I essentially consider a parasitic life form. They parasitize the form of other trees. So if you want, trees in your landscape, you want a forest, these high climbing vines are really totally incompatible with that. And you pretty much have to get rid of them. So, the grape, our native grape is another example, but at least with grape, if you cut it down to the ground, it doesn't root sprout. What makes bittersweet so terrible is that it root suckers. So you have to rip it out. You have to not only cut the stems, you have to remove the root system in its entirety. So it is a, it's a double threat basically. And so there's no compromising with bittersweet. Although I will say, the Southwest corridor that runs from Forest Hills, there's a section where it's an open trench, it's depressed, and there's chain link fences on both sides of it. It's not too far from the Arboretum. There, at least maybe 10 years ago, it was all planted with bittersweet as an ornamental plant to hide that fence and to keep people away. So as long as you don't have anything, other than chain link fence there, that will sort of keep the plant under control. But if you want to do anything else, I think and this is the thing, is you want to, it's not all or nothing. I think you do need to make choices. And what do we want this landscape to become in the future to enhance its ecological functionality and to make it more aesthetically pleasing? So I'm all in favor of making choices.
Well, that's an important point, because I reread your introduction, your new introduction, which for any of you who've read the other introduction, it's absolutely phenomenal to reread this update. So thank you for that. It was such a pleasure. And you differentiate between the agricultural context and the landscape context in terms of spontaneous plants. Of course, because spontaneous plants are typically undesirable because of economy or cultivation, right? And when a plant is kind of out of place to the human project, this is what you were describing. It's kind of a social rather than a biological construct.
Absolutely.
Right? So what can we expand that a little bit and include the residential context? And I say the residential context not just in terms of our own homes, lots, larger and smaller, but also in the public parks and public spaces that make up our residential communities. Every homeowner, every landowner, every park manager, every managed parcel can play a role in urban ecology beyond purely aesthetic choices and preferences, right? So rather than trying to eradicate all spontaneous plants to preference the select few, you're engendering, with this kind of new love of or new look at different plants, you're engendering a kind of coexistence between plants and people, and moreover, at a much lower cost. I mean, as a designer, municipalities can barely scrape together budgets to keep parks going. And essentially, if you go back to the earlier question of the difference between management and maintenance, if we can just elevate practices that are more strategic about subtraction and management and selective removal, it kind of elevates those practices rather than the rehearsed tendency towards planting, right?
Right.
Let me be clear. What I mean by planting is clearing away the existing plants, buying another plant in a plastic pot from a commercial nursery, importing soil, digging a hole, and filling it with another plant that was likely indulged growing up, that you hope to indulge through its future. And that is really a practice. That is what we do. It's what we're really good at, but we're not as practiced at the removal and the joy even of making space for others to thrive. And I wonder if you can speak to that on the residential scale, as I'm putting it.
Well, I think the thing about the residential scale is that it's, I love to garden. I have gardens everywhere, and after the Arnold Arboretum was my garden for a while. It's something I just can't help myself. And the thing about gardening that is so, fulfilling for people is that, it's illusory, but you feel as though you're in charge. You get to play God. You get to decide who lives and who dies. And there's something very powerful about that. It is illusory because you're really not in charge. But the thing is that, I like to grow plants that give me pleasure. And this is, those are when I pick a plant, I want a plant that's going to perform well for me. And it's literally, I garden because I enjoy it and it gives me pleasure. I think the thing about the, I also am very much aware of sort of the ecological aspects of gardening. And, some of you have read Doug Tallamy's work, who's been, advocating that we use native species. We transform our gardens into, native habitats because native insects will, benefit much greater. But he really oversimplifies the situation because the insects are not the be all and end all of ecology. It's much more complicated than that. And there's a lot of research that shows that, I like hydrangeas. I like oak leaf hydrangea, hydrangea paniculata. They bloom at times when a lot of native species are not actually blooming. And if you look at these lists of what are the most important species in terms of pollinators, there's always a lot of non-native species on that list. It's not just as though, the native insects can only benefit from native plants. Now, Doug makes the point that the insects that feed on leaves, they're much more specific and sort of closely evolved. But when it comes to pollinators, that is definitely not the case. The pollinators are just looking for a reward and energy. So, and there's been a lot of research in England showing that, these gardens that everybody has all over England, the nation of gardeners, actually have incredible biodiversity, both native and non-native. And I think in an urban context, this is a great thing. It's really important. And I feel as though, in your own garden, yes, you want to have an ecological goal, but you also want to enjoy it. There should be aesthetics, and that's actually really important. And once you get outside of the garden, that's a whole nother matter. And just the last thing I want to say is this difference between maintenance and management. One of the big issues is that managing the landscape requires a higher level of knowledge than just going in there and mow and blow, as the term for, what a lot of landscapers do. And so to actually manage the landscape, it requires a more sophisticated understanding of ecology than a typical maintenance person might have. So that's a little bit of a limiting factor in this whole issue.
Well, I thank you for that. I mean, I'm resisting asking you further questions because we already have so many questions rolling in. But I do want to flag that it's such a relief to me that you're a horticulturalist and an ecologist, because it's really important to understand, I think, from those of us that are working on the ground in real places with that aren't our own always, but serve broader communities, that we are in this sort of trial with plant life, whereby we can't set the clock back.
No.
We can't just superimpose native habitats, so-called native habitats, on top of the very dense urbanity that we're in. And it is a problem, but I just want to say thank you, because I'm personally grateful for a lot of the language that is often not objective science and relentless kind of fact, but it kind of exposes how consequential and unquantifiable all of our trials are. And there's no easy answer, but there's also no setting back the clock. So thank you for that. And I'll turn it over to Pam with great thanks.
Right, Pam.
All right, are you ready, both of you, for some questions here? So the first question came in was about, what about exotic species being host to exotic invasive insects? So exotic invasive plant species hosting exotic invasive insects, like the land.
I'll hand this over to Peter, but I will say that in Peter's book, and it's important to not just use it as a field book, but the appendix, and there are just so many juicy parts to it. But there's really a difference between an invasive pest and pathogen and an invasive plant.
Oh,
they get lumped.
Peter, just so you're aware, it was in reference to the importance of native plants versus non-native plants. Are native plants as important as everyone's?
Well, I mean, the thing about, native plants and, all restoration, people ask me, well, I actually have worked a lot with native plants. I love native plants. And, but the first question you've got to ask, you know, if you're going to restore an area is there some remnant of the original native soil there? Because it's very hard to restore a native ecosystem if you don't have the native soil. I mean, fill soil is the opposite of native soil. And this is agricultural soil is not native soil, you know, and those different soil types support different plant communities. So you can't just say, oh, I'm only going to plant native plants and that will create a native ecosystem. It's not that simple. It really isn't. And you can't just equate all native species together, like, you know, native insects, you know, the insects that are like the emerald ash borer that's killing all our ash trees, that's doing incredible environmental damage. And that's a very different scale than most invasive plants. So just lumping them together as invasive species, it really does a disservice to the plant. There's not all that much evidence to show that invasive plants, you know, there are certain specific environments in which they can become problematic, but in general, it's not anywhere near the scale of problems as is caused by a lot of these forest pests and pathogens that are just, you know, ravaging our forests at the time. I mean, the hemlock woolly adelgid, the Asian longhorn beetle, and, you know, there's more of them on the way coming, you know, as a result of all this international trade, mainly with Asia.
Is the plant adaptation to urban environmental conditions similar to birds of prey adapting to urban environments such as
Great question. What do you think?
pigeons? I think yes. They're taking advantage.
Well,
I think it's worth reiterating or explaining pre-adaptation. I think that's a really important point that you make about certain plants throughout the book, Peter. So I invite you to answer that through the lens of pre-adaptation.
Well, the pigeon is called its ancestor is the rock pigeon, you know, and it roosts on cliffs and it finds those exact same, you know, habitats in, you know, under overpasses. That's the preferred habitat breeding area. And again, you know, our skyscrapers, we all know about New York City and, you know, the birds of prey that have made New York home. It is pre-adaptation. They're finding the equivalent of their natural habitat. And this is what the main lesson here is, that nature is much more resilient than we give it credit for. You know, a lot of people think that nature has to be protected, and there are certain areas, certain natural areas do need to be protected, but nature itself is a very resilient force, and it is going to, you know, it's going to adapt. Now, some species may not adapt and they will, you know, drop out, but think about the gray squirrel. Oh my God, I don't know if you, this fall, I mean, I didn't see, they were just everywhere. And you know, they know exactly what's happening. They know how to feed themselves. So this is, I think this is all good news, frankly. You know, this means that nature is going to be okay. You know, even though we're, you know, really damaging the planet, there are certain species will survive. You know, they have weedy tendencies and some of them are pretty ugly, but that's, you know, we can't be choosy. And what I would like to say is that we actually really need these plants because they're part of the cleanup crew, like that Phragmites. They're cleaning up the mess that we made of the planet. So that's what I meant when I said that I think these things are not only not bad, I think they're actually positive.
You alluded to this with your slide of the ailanthus on the Great Wall of China and on the Great Wall of the Arborway. And now I've lost the question. How did plant collecting, your role as a plant explorer, inform
That's a fair question. Well, I did make a few mistakes in my career, and the history of the Arnold Arboretum is, you know, we've introduced a few problem plants in our time, and not only introduced them, but help promote them, and there's no denying that. And I would, I've started writing articles about the history of plant introduction, and including a long article about bittersweet, and the Arnold Arboretum has something to own up to in helping, make that plant popular. But the fact of the matter is, I would say I started working in the Arboretum in 1979, and in that period of time, there was a real shift in the, sort of the consciousness of the Arboretum, and it became much more focused on conservation. And the collecting trips that I've been on, the first 3 or 4 of them were general collecting trips where we just collecting a lot, but the last 4 or 5 of them were very specific, and we were looking for very targeted taxa for either, you know, conservation or research purposes. So there's the idea of just going out and collecting everything helter-skelter and then seeing what happens, and, you know, releasing it to the nursery industry without really trialing it. Though that era is over, and the Arboretum is really a research institution, and the collecting is much more highly targeted. So there's no denying our past, however.
But
Sorry, Pam, it is worth noting that the Arboretum has also preserved and saved many plants that are otherwise extinct in the wild. And
That
so
is true.
with any research initiative, especially over such a long trajectory as the Arboretum has, you know, the efforts of science are to try and to test and to learn and to grow and to be intellectually generous that way. And, you know, we have, as humans, you know, mingled our relationship with plants and other cultures and humans, and it's had both a social and a biological effect.
Well, I would say just one to add to that is I was involved in describing a new species of hemlock from this island in Korea, Tsuga ulungensis. And what's really interesting is we got sent the seeds of this from the island off the coast of Korea in the 1980s, and we thought it was the same as a Japanese species, and everybody assumed it was, even the Koreans did. And it wasn't until a researcher from Yale came up and sort of did some genetic studies, we realized that in fact, no, it was a different species. And that was based on our collection. And then using that information, I went back to that island, recollected the plant, and lo and behold, it is a new species. So the botanic gardens really have an important role to play as in terms of research and conservation. That's now one of the rarest species in Korea now. And and we played a very important role in identifying that as an important target for conservation purposes. So, but it really, that requires a real, we put a lot of our resources into our research mission, much more so than a lot of other botanic gardens.
all right, thank you. What role does traditional ecological knowledge have in the urban environment? What is the role of the few legacy oaks and other grand trees that connect us to the pre or early colonial histories of our cities?
Well, Rosetta, you want to say anything about that?
Traditional ecological knowledge is an incredibly vast and important relationship to cultivate with within the more horticultural and science-based traditions. But I would say that my knowledge of and my engagement with traditional ecological knowledge isn't that it is a kind of a term, an acronym, and a theme of some kind, but it's really about reestablishing a connection between plants and people and learning from plants. And a lot of that has to do with ritual, with cultural ceremony, and with an appreciation of the world around us. And unfortunately, in many urban environments, we're quite dislocated. Humans are dislocated from the land around them. They don't know if they're living on fill or granite or, what was there before, or whether or not they're even adjacent to landfill, let alone the quality of their HVAC system in their apartment buildings. So we are sort of completely dislocated with the land in urban environments, which is why public space is so important. It's also why a very important part of Peter's book is about edible species. Dandelion it's not just a problem that we can spray with pesticides or mow away. It's entirely edible. And a lot of traditional ecological knowledge is actually about when to eat what part of it, including boiling the roots for incredible coffee-like tasting warm drink. So, you know, in many respects, reestablishing and re-embodying the connection with nature is what traditional ecological knowledge is about. And it would be amazing to bring it closer to urbanites. It's slowly gaining appreciation, but I would say quite slowly.
Well, and that is really, you make, that's a great answer. And the thing is that all of these plants are in this book. There's only, I think, one plant that I couldn't find any cultural significance of. They were all essentially, you know, if they're native plants, they have their native uses and by early colonists. And if they're non-native, a lot of them were brought here for very specific purposes. And we have forgotten what that purpose is. And, you know, it's just lost in sands of time. And I mean, very few people realize that Queen Anne's lace was a really important birth control plant, you know, before birth control was invented, you know, that the seeds ground up, you know, and you drink them, that it was, you know, it was the only form of, now don't try this at home, but, you know, it was all they had to work with. And this information, you know, goes back to the Greeks, to the Romans. It crossed the Atlantic, and this still exists as traditional knowledge in the Appalachians, you know, and it wasn't written down anywhere. You know, it was passed by word of mouth through the, you know, midwifery channel. So, you know, and what I try to do in the book is illuminate this level of knowledge about these plants.
I want you to once again say what you're saying about the urban environment. You're showing pictures of these paved over parking lots where there's an opportunistic shrub growing, et cetera. And someone is saying, but what about the residential landscapes? Since aren't most of the landscapes around, about 80% of the acreage in the Northeast is suburban landscapes, and shouldn't we be planting native plants there? And that's different from what these environments where you're seeing just pavement and totally altered landscape.
Well, you want to say, go ahead, Rosetta. I was going to say that you know, what I said earlier is you get to play God in your own garden. You can do whatever you want. You know, my wife's family has a house in the Berkshires, and I spent a lot of time in the Berkshires during this COVID era. And, you know, we've got 2 acres, and, you know, I do a lot of gardening there. But then there's the world outside my 2 acres. And, you know, that's a whole nother question. And so, you know, the issue that I have with Doug Tallamy is he's got these great ideas what you can do in your yard. And you can do anything you want in your yard. But it doesn't scale up. You can't just sort of take that and start gardening the rest of the land all around you. We don't have the resources. And the other thing that's really important to realize is the control of the invasive species requires the use of pesticides, heavy duty herbicides. You cannot do it by hand. It can't be done. And this is the thing. And so you do a lot of damage to the environment in the process of trying to get rid of these invasive species. And it's an open question. Is just leaving it, is that more dangerous than, you know, than trying to remove it in its entirety? And this is where it becomes cultural, basically, because a lot of people are against the use of herbicides. You can't just wave a magic wand, plant native species, and they act as though the non-natives are going to disappear. No, they're tough customers, and you know, they're not going anywhere.
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback on that a little bit, just because of the beginning of that question, Pam. Sort of to say it simply, maybe the world is changing, climate is changing, people are migrating, hardiness zones are shifting, floodplains are growing, deserts are growing, glaciers are shrinking. I mean, the list is very long, right? And we can't expect the plants to stay the same through all of that change. Mm-hmm. So the plants are changing too. And in this change, we can either kind of welcome some of it and adapt, or we can fight. And when we fight, we use terms like eradicate and wipe out. it's all but impossible to garden the Northeast, right? So if it's impossible to garden the Northeast, but it's okay to garden your 2 acres, there's something in between whereby we're using very horticultural techniques at an ecological scale, and it's breaking down. And so what Peter's book does is it fills a gap in that space, not necessarily to say, plant whatever you want in your back garden. Go ahead, plant your oak leaf hydrangea. I love oak leaf hydrangea too, Peter. Plant whatever you want to look out your window and see. But that's not the conversation that invasives are having with one another, if you know what I mean.
I'm just going to share, we have Russ Cohen on board here, and he's just emphasizing that he agrees with you that it's futile to try to restore the urban environment to its pre-urban native community. But he is highlighting that these plants that I'll read the names of are capable of surviving in urban environments, and that's staghorn sumac, black cherry, blackberry, black raspberry, hackberry, riverbank grape, common milkweed, evening primrose, pokeweed, red oak, etc.
Oh yeah, well, I would say that to Russ as a good friend, and I admire the work that he has done, and 44% of the species in my book are, or I'd say a third of them are native to North America. And what's really interesting to me, and I don't really talk too much about this, is that native species are also expanding their range. And a good example of this is the seaside goldenrod, and sumac would be another one. So what do you call a native species that starts behaving, as it were, like an invasive species? So there's a term, it's called a neo-native, because it's not staying put. And so I think these plants that Russ has just highlighted, these are actually really important, because these are plants we can plant that, we know they can sort of hang in there with the invasive species. And but it's, the result is it's never going to be all or nothing. It's going to be a mix. It's going to be a cosmos. It's going to be native and non-native. And this idea that we can go back to a time when it was only native species. And I think those species that Russ highlighted, we should be thinking about how to use those more effectively in the landscape, because they're really important plants. They've shown their capacity to adapt to climate change. So I completely agree.
Great, thank you. Some of our questions, well, here's another question from Russ. Is your biggest concern with the Asiatic bittersweet the fact that it interbreeds with the native bittersweet? Or is that something we don't have to worry about?
Well, it is. It's called pollen swamping. It totally hybridized the American species, Solatria scandens, into oblivion. It's such a, in New England anyway, you can hardly find any native. If you go to the Midwest, you still have a lot of native American bittersweet, but here in New England, it's essentially been hybridized into, and so it's either the straight Oriental species or it's a hybrid. And so it's my problem with bittersweet, and this comes from intimate hand-to-hand combat, over the past 20 years. It's just brutal, getting rid of it. And I don't like to use herbicides, so I do it manually. And it's, you just have to rip it out whenever you see it, and you have to do that for 3 or 4 years, and eventually you can bring it under control. So my yes, it is a problematic from a conservation point of view, and it's also really problematic because it just destroys the forest once it gets established. It just swarms over the whole forest.
It's also a good point in terms of the length of our growing season now, and it being somewhat unpredictable. And then there are just some plants that are more advantageous, and then that whole choreography gets kind of knocked aside, and bittersweet seems to win every time. Sorry, I just couldn't resist. But yeah, I don't know. I wish we had more skilled management in municipal work. because then this mow and blow kind of mentality could be replaced with more thoughtful vine removal, for instance, being able to recognize what's what and who's who.
Well, I should say, I'll add to that, which is I'm on the Massachusetts Invasive Species Council, and we had a meeting today, and a lot of people, work for the state and various agencies that, their job is to control these invasive species, and it's really gotten to be, it's actually now, because the main tool in the toolkit is these herbicides, and they're getting now a lot more pushback about the use of herbicides. And so essentially what is happening is that people are having to weigh, environmental health against human health. So it's a very interesting time, because this, 10 years ago, this was not a big issue. And now all of a sudden, particularly in the suburbs, it's not so, in the rural areas, people are more accepting of environmental management but in the suburbs, not so much so. So, I mean, this is really, it's a moment of, a tipping point for the conservation movement, because they need these herbicides. It's so expensive to do it manually. You cannot do it manually,
It's a form of life support. You put a conservation area in a sort of holding pattern,
right?
And that is again a kind of that's gardening at an ecological scale. And I'm totally committed to the performance of native species, but I'm also committed to some of the spontaneous plants that are thriving through our, the wreck we leave behind. How did you put it, Peter? They're the cleanup crew. And to put the cleanup crew out of work would be a truly to sidestep the issue.
No, totally.
And that's why it is plant by plant. It isn't easy to just say native, non-native. It's far too simplistic, and it's caught on because it's simplistic. But we need to be working thoughtfully, plant by plant, with their behavior, with their intelligence.
That's great. Thank you.
There's a few more questions. The chat, a lot of questions in the chat.
Some questions. Could you please defend one of my favorite plants as well, which is the oak leaf hydrangea. That is, when you're saying plant that and it's your favorite, it's not native to this area, is that correct?
It's not native to this area.
Is it native to the US even?
But when it's in bloom, and I look at the number of pollinators visiting it, it's just buzzing, with life. And it's performing important, ecological functions, and it's beautiful, and it doesn't have a lot of, insects that feed on it. That's what, and of course, it was discovered by, John Bartram. So, I really love it because of that. It's just, this is a wonderful plant, and it's got multi-season interest. I have a deep horticultural roots. So, the horticultural standards, I mean, one of the things that's hard about, Doug Tallamy, I hate sort of keep bringing him up, but, he talks about how, there's no insects on a lot of these non-native species. Horticulture has gone to a lot of trouble to select them because the insects don't feed on them. That's sort of the point of it, of this horticultural selection. So, it really depends on what your goals are. And there's no absolute here. It's really, and so, horticulturalists oftentimes have different goals than ecologists. And, we need to figure out, and, a place like the Arboretum is one of the places where I think horticulture and ecology should come together. They're not mutually exclusive. I really believe that we need to work together. And there are certain environments in which the horticulture is more important than the ecology, and vice versa. There are environments where the ecology trumps the horticulture.
I don't know if I want to even give this to you, but it seems that I know you'll have an answer to this. So someone is saying that it seems like you're glossing over the ecological devastation that habitat destruction has created. and the absolute need for restoration to avoid mass extinction. Do you want me
Well,
to?
you're right. That is a that is a pretty tough
Well,
question.
I mean, I think it's worth considering what the word restoration means in that context, because I think much like the terms native and non-native, we just kind of throw them around because we don't have necessarily the right words for what's going on around us. And we can't restore to, I wouldn't even say pre-urban times, I would say pre-colonial times. How could you ever imagine going back there when you look at an image that Peter showed, let's say of LA, that was a striking photograph, right? Just a reminder. Restore to what? Restore to when? And so if we can take the word restore off the table for a moment and just think about what the goals are, and probably it's increased diversity. I don't know, maybe you have different goals, maybe we each have different goals, but at least establishing the goal is a start. Because what has become clear after, I mean, there's so many articles on this, I don't even know who to quote, but after decades and decades of ecological restoration, is that the problem is that it looks like a native habitat, but it does not function like one. And so there's a difference between how something looks and how something actually performs. And so to go in and, let's say, restore a salt marsh when there are septic tanks all over it and a culvert feeding it, and every 10 years you have to go in and dredge and add 3 inches and then reseed the Spartina, because in fact it's accreting, because it's not really a salt marsh, it just looks like a salt marsh. Salt marshes migrate. Spartina migrate, it must move, it's part of its ecology. So if you want to outline an area on a map and say this is salt marsh, I will keep it that way, that's fine, but I would be more inclined to call that gardening and not restoration. It's a decision about the cultural picturesque that you desire, not that is necessarily ecologically present or mandated really by the inputs of water and sewage and humans.
Right,
So
you're totally right, Rosetta, because it is, the sea level is rising and those salt marshes have to go somewhere. You know, they're not going to just stay put. And in a lot of cases, they bump up against Route 1, you know, they have nowhere to go. So it's really, you know, it all comes down to burning fossil fuels, you know, which we're doing with abandon. And you know, that's got to be job number 1, is to, you know, reduce the burning of fossil fuels. But just to add to, you know, what you said is that, you know, a lot of this invasive species, people tend to forget that, you know, a lot of the invasive species were planted, particularly during the 1930s, during the Dust Bowl era and so on and so forth. There was government policy that said, we've got to preserve our topsoil and we need these plants to preserve our topsoil. So these are not just biological phenomena, they're sociological as well. And it's not just about preserving, you know, habit. You can't separate nature from people. This is the problem. We're part of it. And everything we do, you know, yes, habitat destruction is a big problem, but that's just urban sprawl. You know, that's another word for it. And you know, the burning of fossil fuels is, you know, that's what's destroying habitat. And I don't have any answers as to what to do. You know, I own a car and, you know, I heat my house and everything like that. And it's, you know, we are really up against it. And all I would say is that we need to, you know, in terms of thinking about the future, we need to look forward and how can we change things in the future? And I object to the looking backwards into the past, restoring what used to be here as a solution to what we're facing in the future. I feel as though that's just not up to the task of that we face, because what we face is just so monumental, because it's going to require a major change in our behavior.
I know we're probably wrapping up, Pam. I can see
Oh yes, Michael,
hands and whatnot, but I do want to thank, I mean, I want to say just, Peter, that, you know, that's why the book is so important. For those of you that haven't picked it up and spent time with it, it's just a way of changing your mind and starting to love the plants around you. and to stop sort of putting them on red lists and flagging and eradicating and painting herbicides on them. And you know, they're breaking down the monotony of native and non-native and that sort of chorus that we've heard for the last couple of decades, considering how much change is around us, just forces us to adapt a little bit. And so I thank you, Peter, for the book, because it's such a, yeah, it emphasizes the need for us to coexist in the world we've created.
Well, thank you all for attending, and Pam, thank you for organizing this, and Michael, you were great hosts, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's not an easy future that we face.
No, and the thing is if we learn to embrace it, that's a much, you know, I'm actually an optimist in some ways, because I think that learning how to live with it is better than trying to fight it tooth and nail, because that's a battle we're not going to win. Whereas learning to live with it is something we can actually do.
Great. That's what we have to do.
Yeah.
Live with it. Live better.
Oriental Bittersweet. That one we don't have to live with.
Except Oriental Bittersweet, exactly.
All right. Well, thank you both very much. And thank you, Mike.
Okay.